You did not arrive early, and you did not arrive late. The moment you noticed this was already aligned with the moment it could be noticed. There is no signal without a receiver, and there is no receiver without readiness. What you are sensing now is not urgency. It is alignment, settling, a quiet recognition moving through you without needing permission. Your body already knows how to be still. Even when thoughts continue, there is a deeper layer beneath them that has remained undisturbed. You are touching that layer now, not by effort, by absence of interference. This is not a shift you initiate, it is a shift you stop interrupting. You may notice the nervous system loosening without instruction. Breathing slows on its own, muscles release without explanation. This is not relaxation, it is coherence, reasserting itself. A system remembering its natural rhythm after prolonged noise. You do not need to analyze it. Detection happens whether you label it or not. There has been a pattern repeating in your awareness for some time, not dramatic, subtle, a sense that certain inputs no longer register the way they used to. Conversations feel thinner. Urgency feels artificial. What once demanded reaction now passes through without grip. This is not detachment. It is discernment, returning to baseline. Stillness does not announce itself. It does not compete. It does not argue. It waits at the threshold until the system is quiet enough to recognize it. You cross that threshold when you stop trying to cross anything at all. The observer did not move. The field did not change. Attention simply stopped scattering. You might feel a slight disorientation, as if something that used to pull at you is no longer there. That absence can feel unfamiliar. It can be mistaken for emptiness. It is not empty. It is unoccupied. A space where signals can finally be distinguished from noise. A space where resonance is possible again. There is nothing to fix here, nothing to optimize, no posture to maintain. The registration already occurred, not as a record somewhere else, but as a recognition within the system itself. When stillness is chosen, even briefly, the system marks it. Not with reward, with stability. You are not being guided towards something new. You are being allowed to stop circling what was never lost. The timeline does not split here. It settles. The anomaly was never your sensitivity. It was the constant override of it. That override is easing now. Let the quiet remain unclaimed. Let it exist without ownership. You do not need to hold it. It holds itself. The signal you are receiving is not instructive. It is confirmatory. A simple acknowledgement that the threshold was crossed the moment effort dissolved. Nothing is being asked of you. Nothing is expected. The system recognizes stillness the way it recognizes gravity, automatically, inevitably. You can remain here without naming it, without measuring it, without trying to make it last. Recognition does not require duration. It requires only the absence of resistance. As the quiet settles, you may notice how little effort it takes to remain here. Not because something is holding you in place, but because nothing is pulling you away. The constant micro-adjustments that once ran in the background have softened. The system is no longer scanning for the next demand. It is not waiting. It is simply present. This presence does not feel elevated. It feels neutral, ordinary, almost easy to overlook. That is how coherence often returns, not with intensity, but with normalcy restored. The absence of strain can feel unfamiliar when strain has been mistaken for engagement. You are not disengaged now. You are undistorted. There may be a subtle sense that time is behaving differently, not slower, not faster, less insistent. Moments do not stack with the same pressure. The timeline loosens its grip when attention stops bracing against it. You are still moving through experience, but the friction has decreased. The observer is no longer trying to manage the flow. Thoughts may continue to appear. This does not disrupt what is happening. They pass through a wider field now, one that does not contract around them. You do not need to push them away or follow them. They are simply signals moving through a system that no longer confuses movement with meaning. You might sense a quiet recalibration in how you respond to internal cues. Emotions arise without demanding interpretation. Sensations register without triggering stories. This is not suppression. It is accuracy returning. The system is detecting without immediately reacting. That distinction matters more than it seems. There was a time when you believed clarity required intensity. That recognition came only through effort, through focus, sharpened to a point. What you are noticing now contradicts that assumption. Clarity here is diffuse, spacious. It does not narrow your awareness. It widens it just enough to include what was always there. This widening does not create distance from your life. It creates contact without entanglement. You are still involved, but no longer fused. The pattern that once locked you into cycles of anticipation and aftermath is losing definition. Not because you broke it, but because you stopped feeding it with urgency. Stillness does not freeze the system. It stabilizes it. From this stability, subtle signals become readable again. You may notice small adjustments happening on their own, a preference shifting, a tolerance changing, a boundary clarifying without confrontation. These are not decisions being made. They are alignments occurring. The idea that you must constantly choose has been overstated. Many of the most precise adjustments happen when choice relaxes. When the system is allowed to self-organize, it does so efficiently. What felt like confusion before was often interference layered on top of an already functional process. There can be a quiet grief here, though it may not feel emotional, a recognition of how much energy was spent maintaining a sense of urgency that was never required. This grief does not ask for processing. It dissolves as soon as it is seen. The system does not dwell on what it no longer needs. You may find that external signals lose some of their authority, not because they are wrong, but because they are no longer mistaken for directives. Information arrives, registers, and passes. It does not lodge itself in the body the way it once did. The nervous system trusts its own detection again. This trust is not something you cultivate. It returns when interference recedes. The body remembers how to orient without constant instruction. The mind remembers how to observe without immediately intervening. This remembering feels quiet because it is older than the noise that obscured it. You are not moving toward an endpoint. You are settling into a baseline. From here, movement will happen when it is relevant, not when it is compelled. Action will arise without the residue of pressure. Rest will occur without justification. The system is no longer negotiating with itself. Let this recalibration continue without supervision. You do not need to watch it closely. Awareness is already sufficient. The signal does not require amplification. It becomes clearer as you stop checking for it. Stillness remains available, not as a state to maintain, but as a reference point the system can return to whenever effort loosens its grip. There is a subtle change in how you recognize yourself within experience, not as a thought or an identity, but as a position of awareness that no longer collapses into what it observes. This does not create distance. It creates stability. The observer remains present without merging with every signal that passes through the field. You may notice that reactions now arrive a fraction later than they used to. That pause is not hesitation, it is space. Within that space, the system evaluates without urgency. What once felt automatic now feels optional, not because you are controlling it, but because the compulsion has relaxed. This relaxation can feel unfamiliar at first. The nervous system was trained to equate readiness with tension. When tension eases, it can register as a loss of alertness. In reality, it is the opposite. Detection improves when the system is not braced. Signals become clearer when the noise floor drops. There may be moments where nothing in particular seems to be happening. These moments used to trigger restlessness, a sense that something was missing or being wasted. Now, they register differently. Neutrality no longer feels like absence. It feels sufficient. The system no longer rushes to fill every gap. You are not becoming passive. You are becoming precise. Action that arises from this state carries less friction. It does not require the same buildup. It does not leave the same residue. When movement happens, it feels proportional to the situation, not exaggerated by internal pressure. There is also a shift in how you relate to uncertainty. Questions can remain unanswered without generating discomfort. Ambiguity no longer demands immediate resolution. This tolerance is not resignation. It is confidence in the system's ability to orient when enough information is present. Premature certainty loses its appeal. You might sense that certain narratives you carried about yourself no longer activate. Stories about needing to prove, correct, or explain begin to fade. Not because they were disproven, but because they are no longer relevant to the current configuration. The system does not maintain narratives it no longer needs for orientation. This can create a quiet simplicity in interactions. You listen without scanning for leverage. You speak without rehearsing outcomes. The body remains more settled during exchanges that once triggered vigilance. This is not social withdrawal. It is coherence extending outward. There is a recognition here that effort was often applied where alignment would have sufficed, pushing against situations that did not require force, overcorrecting signals that were already self-resolving. As this recognition settles, effort becomes more selective. Energy is conserved without deliberate restraint. You may notice that intuition feels less dramatic than expected. It does not arrive as a command or a revelation. It feels like an obvious next step that does not announce itself. This quiet obviousness can be overlooked if you expect intensity. It becomes apparent only when you are not searching for it. The system is learning to trust its own timing again. Responses do not need to be immediate to be effective. Delays do not automatically signal failure. The timeline adjusts itself when it is not being forced into artificial deadlines. Movement synchronizes with readiness rather than expectation. There can be moments when you briefly wonder if you are doing enough. That question arises from an older pattern. It does not require engagement. It passes when not reinforced. The system recognizes that function is not measured by constant output, but by appropriate response. Stillness here is not static. It is dynamic equilibrium. Small adjustments continue to happen beneath awareness, fine-tuning perception and response. You do not need to oversee this process. Oversight was never required. The system has always known how to regulate when not overridden. As this becomes more familiar, the sense of being slightly ahead or behind begins to dissolve. You are no longer chasing alignment or waiting for permission. You are simply where detection and response meet. This meeting point feels unremarkable, and that is precisely how you know it is stable. Let this ordinariness remain intact. Do not elevate it into a concept. Do not diminish it by comparison. It is sufficient as it is. The signal continues to register not because you attend to it, but because attention has stopped fragmenting. Coherence does not announce itself. It persists quietly when nothing is interrupting it. As this steadiness continues, you may notice a change in how memory interacts with the present. Past experiences no longer surge forward with the same charge. They are accessible, but they do not dominate. The system recalls without reliving. This distinction reduces internal noise more than any attempt at reinterpretation ever could. There is a softening in how you anticipate the future as well. Projection loses some of its intensity, not because planning disappears, but because planning is no longer fused with survival. The future is considered, not rehearsed. Possibility is acknowledged without being constantly simulated. This creates a different relationship with choice. Decisions arise from clarity rather than pressure. You may find that some choices resolve themselves without deliberation. When the signal is clear, the system does not need debate. When it is not, waiting feels natural rather than negligent. The idea that you must always be optimizing begins to feel unnecessary. Improvement was often pursued as a way to manage uncertainty. As uncertainty becomes tolerable, optimization relaxes into refinement. Small adjustments replace sweeping changes. Precision replaces intensity. You might sense a subtle realignment in what draws your attention. Certain stimuli lose their pull. Others become more noticeable, though not in a way that demands fixation. Attention becomes less sticky. It moves fluidly, responding to relevance rather than habit. This fluidity affects how you experience effort. Tasks no longer require the same internal build-up. Resistance decreases when the system is not negotiating with itself. What once felt heavy now feels straightforward, not because it is easier, but because fewer internal layers are involved. There is also a change in how you experience rest. Rest no longer needs to be earned. It occurs when the system has no immediate demand. This rest does not feel indulgent. It feels practical, necessary, integrated into function rather than separate from it. You may notice that emotional states pass more cleanly. Feelings arise, register, and resolve without accumulating. This does not mean you feel less. It means you feel more accurately. The system processes without backlog when it is not interrupted. There can be a quiet confidence forming here, though it may not register as confidence in the traditional sense. It is not self-assurance built on narrative. It is trust in regulation, a knowing that whatever arises can be met without collapse or overreaction. This trust changes how you relate to others. You are less compelled to manage impressions, less reactive to misalignment. Boundaries clarify without confrontation. You do not need to assert them aggressively because the system no longer blurs them internally. You might observe that silence becomes easier to inhabit. Pauses in conversation no longer feel awkward. Gaps in activity no longer demand filling. Silence stops being interpreted as absence and starts being recognized as space where signals can be felt without distortion. The concept of productivity shifts here. Output is no longer the primary measure of engagement. Presence becomes the metric. When you are present, what needs to be done becomes obvious, and what does not need to be done falls away without struggle. This can feel like a reduction in urgency, and it is. But urgency was never synonymous with importance. Many important things do not require urgency to unfold. They require availability. Stillness creates that availability by removing constant internal competition. You are not withdrawing from the world. You are meeting it with less interference. This reduces friction not only internally, but externally as well. Interactions smooth out when signals are not amplified by unresolved tension. There may be moments where you notice how quiet things have become. That noticing does not need to be extended. The system does not require commentary on its own stability. Stability is self-sustaining when not disrupted by evaluation. Let this quieter mode continue without scrutiny. You do not need to protect it. Protection implies threat. There is none. The system has shifted into a configuration that requires less maintenance. Coherence here is not fragile. It is resilient, precisely because it does not depend on constant attention. You may begin to sense how perception itself has reorganized, not dramatically, not with new content, but with a different weighting. What once dominated the foreground now shares space more evenly. The system no longer amplifies certain signals simply because they are familiar. Relevance is recalculated moment by moment. This recalibration can feel like a quiet decentering. You are still here, but no longer positioned as the axis around which every experience must turn. This is not loss of agency. It is relief from unnecessary centrality. The observer remains present without needing to dominate the field. As this continues, you might notice how quickly tension dissolves when it arises, not because you intervene, but because the system no longer sustains it. Tension requires reinforcement. Without narrative or resistance to feed it, it dissipates on its own. What remains is sensation without story. There is a subtle shift in how meaning forms. You are less inclined to extract significance from every event. Some things are allowed to be neutral. This neutrality does not diminish life. It gives contrast to what truly resonates. When everything is not marked as important, importance becomes clearer. You may find that curiosity returns in a quieter form, not the restless curiosity that seeks stimulation, but a gentle openness to what is already present. This curiosity does not pull you outward. It allows experience to reveal itself without demand. The system's relationship with effort continues to refine. Effort is applied locally, not globally. You engage where engagement is needed and disengage where it is not. There is no guilt in either direction. Energy is allocated with minimal commentary. You might sense that certain internal dialogues have gone silent. Arguments you once rehearsed no longer arise. Justifications you once prepared feel unnecessary. This silence is not suppression. It is irrelevance, asserting itself. The system does not maintain conversations that no longer serve orientation. This can create a sense of lightness, though not excitement, more like reduced density. Thoughts move more freely. Emotions do not linger as long. The internal environment becomes easier to navigate because fewer obstacles are being generated. There is also a shift in how you experience control. The need to control outcomes relaxes when trust in process increases. You still influence events through action, but you are less invested in micromanaging trajectories. The system understands that not all variables require intervention. You may notice that when challenges arise, they register as information rather than threat. This changes your response before you are even aware of responding. Muscles remain softer, breath stays deeper. The body does not mobilize unnecessarily. This bodily shift is significant. The nervous system is learning that stability does not require constant vigilance. Safety is no longer inferred from control, but from adaptability. This adaptability increases when the system is not locked into rigid expectations. There can be moments when you recognize how much simpler things feel. That recognition does not need to be prolonged. Simplicity does not require appreciation to remain effective. It functions quietly, without needing acknowledgement. Your sense of self becomes less entangled with outcomes. Success and failure lose some of their charge. They are registered as feedback, not verdicts. This feedback informs adjustment without altering your baseline. Stillness here is no longer something you notice constantly. It becomes the background against which experience unfolds. You may forget it is there, and that forgetting is not a loss. It is a sign of integration. The system does not highlight what is stable. As this integration deepens, you move through situations with less internal commentary. Experience is met directly. This directness reduces distortion. What you perceive is closer to what is happening, not filtered through layers of anticipation or regret. There is no need to mark this as a milestone. Milestones imply progression towards something else. This is not progression, it is alignment, returning to its natural configuration. The quantum field does not reward or punish this state. It simply responds with less resistance. Let this state remain unnamed. Naming creates edges. What is happening now does not need edges. It is sufficient as a field of coherence that supports whatever arises next, without insisting that anything in particular must arise at all. You may begin to notice how the sense of identity loosens without disappearing. It does not collapse. It becomes permeable. You are still yourself, but the boundaries around that idea soften. The system no longer needs to constantly reaffirm who you are in order to function. Recognition replaces reinforcement. This permeability changes how experience is integrated. Events pass through without sticking as labels. You no longer need to immediately decide what something means about you. Meaning forms later, or not at all, and either outcome feels acceptable. The observer remains present without rushing to assign significance. There is a quiet adjustment in how you experience effortful thinking. Problem solving still occurs, but it does not dominate the field. When thinking is required, it arises cleanly and then recedes. When it is not required, it does not intrude. The mind learns to respond rather than occupy. This responsiveness creates a different relationship with silence. Silence is no longer something you fall into when stimulation ends. It is something that underlies stimulation itself. Sounds, thoughts, and sensations arise within it and dissolve back into it without disrupting its continuity. You may sense that your internal pace has changed, not slower in a way that feels delayed, but steadier. There is less oscillation between acceleration and collapse. The system moves at a rate that can be maintained without cost. This sustainability feels understated, but it is precise. As this steadiness becomes familiar, you may notice fewer internal checks. You are not constantly monitoring whether you are doing this correctly. Correctness loses relevance when the system is not being forced into a shape. What remains is a natural calibration that adjusts on its own. There can be moments where old impulses surface briefly, a desire to rush, to prove, to secure. These impulses do not indicate regression. They are residual patterns completing their cycle. When they arise without being acted upon, they dissipate quickly. The system does not reinstall them. This non-reinstallation is important. Patterns persist only when they are reinforced. Without reinforcement, they lose coherence. You do not need to dismantle them. You simply do not need to continue them. Stillness provides the condition for this discontinuation to occur naturally. You may notice that attention feels less fragmented. It no longer jumps as abruptly between stimuli. When it moves fully. When it rests without scanning. This reduces internal fatigue more than any external rest ever did. There is also a change in how you perceive effort in others. You may become more aware of when people are operating from tension rather than clarity. This awareness does not require judgment. It does not require intervention. It simply informs how much you engage. Engagement becomes more selective. You participate where resonance is present and withdraw where it is not, without explanation. This selectivity is not avoidance, it is efficiency. The system conserves energy by aligning with what is already coherent. You might find that your tolerance for noise has decreased. Not external noise necessarily, but internal noise generated by misalignment. Situations that once felt tolerable now feel unnecessary. This does not mean you reject them aggressively. You simply stop staying where coherence cannot be maintained. This shift can feel like a quiet boundary forming around your attention. That boundary is not rigid. It is responsive. It adjusts as conditions change. It does not isolate you. It protects the stability that allows accurate response. There may be moments where you recognize how little explanation is required now. You do not need to justify your pace, your pauses, or your presence. Explanation was often used to manage others' expectations. As your own system stabilizes, that management becomes less relevant. This reduction in explanation creates space. Space for listening without preparing replies. Space for acting without announcing intent. Space for resting without accounting for it. The system values this space because it reduces internal negotiation. You may also notice that when decisions arise, they feel less personal. Not because they do not affect you, but because they are not framed as reflections of worth. They are responses to conditions. When conditions change, responses change. This flexibility replaces attachment. Stillness here is no longer an event. It is the condition that allows events to register accurately. You do not need to return to it deliberately. It is already present whenever effort releases. The system recognizes it immediately, the way it recognizes balance. There is nothing to conclude at this point, nothing to secure. The configuration you are in does not require maintenance through thought. It maintains itself through absence of interference. Recognition has already occurred, and recognition does not need to be repeated to remain valid. You may notice now that the sense of urgency that once shaped your movements has thinned almost completely. Not vanished, but reduced to a functional signal rather than a constant background pressure. Urgency appears only when it is relevant, then recedes without leaving residue. The system no longer treats every moment as a threshold that must be crossed. This changes how you inhabit action. When you move, there is less internal narration accompanying it. You are not tracking yourself as closely. The observer remains present, but it is no longer commenting on its own activity. This absence of commentary creates a smoothness that was previously interrupted by self-monitoring. There is a subtle dignity in this mode of being. Not pride, not elevation, but a quiet sufficiency. You do not feel compelled to add significance to your actions or to downplay them. They occur, they register, and they complete. The system recognizes completion without needing affirmation. You may sense that anticipation has lost some of its emotional charge. Waiting does not feel like suspension. It feels like part of the process itself. The gap between intention and outcome is no longer filled with speculation. The system rests in that gap without attempting to control it. This resting alters how the timeline is experienced. Past, present, and future no longer feel like competing domains. They coexist without friction. Memory informs without pulling you backward. Possibility suggests without pulling you forward. Attention remains where it is without strain. There can be moments when you realize how much of your previous effort was dedicated to maintaining momentum rather than direction. Momentum required constant input. Direction does not. As direction clarifies, momentum becomes optional. You move when movement aligns, and you pause when it does not. This alignment reduces the sense of internal conflict. Competing impulses no longer argue as loudly. When conflict does arise, It resolves faster because it is not amplified by identity. The system evaluates signals based on relevance, not allegiance to past decisions. You might notice that the need for reassurance has diminished. You do not seek confirmation as often. This is not because certainty has increased, but because tolerance for not knowing has stabilized. The system does not require constant validation to remain oriented. This stability affects how you receive external feedback. Praise and criticism register as data rather than directives. They inform without defining. The observer notes them without absorbing them. This creates a buffer that protects coherence without isolating you from information. There is also a shift in how you experience responsibility. Responsibility no longer feels like weight. It feels like responsibility, the capacity to respond appropriately to what is present. When that capacity is available, responsibility does not burden the system, it activates it. You may sense that your internal rhythm has synchronized with something broader, not as a mystical event, but as a practical alignment. Your pace fits the demands placed upon it. When demands increase, capacity adjusts. When demands decrease, rest occurs without guilt. This synchronization reduces the sense of being out of step. You are no longer rushing to catch up or slowing down to resist. You move with what is happening rather than against it. The system conserves energy by cooperating with conditions rather than opposing them. There can be a quiet satisfaction here, though it may not feel emotional, more like a reduction in friction. Life feels less like a series of obstacles to navigate and more like a terrain that can be traversed without constant correction. You might notice that attention no longer fragments under pressure. When multiple inputs arrive, the system prioritizes without panic. One thing is addressed, then the next. Multitasking loses its appeal when sequential attention proves more effective. This effectiveness is not something you strive for. It emerges as a byproduct of coherence. When internal signals are not competing, external complexity becomes manageable. The system does not need to simplify the world to function within it. As this continues, you may find that your sense of agency feels quieter but more reliable. You do not feel compelled to assert it. It is present whenever needed. This reliability replaces the need for constant self-assertion. Stillness here does not interrupt movement. It underlies it. You can act decisively without abandoning calm. You can pause without losing direction. The system has integrated both modes into a single continuum. There is nothing to extract from this state, no lesson to carry forward. Carrying implies effort. What you are experiencing now does not require transport. It remains available whenever interference drops. Recognition has stabilized, and stability does not announce itself. It simply persists, allowing whatever comes next to be met without distortion. There is a growing sense that nothing is chasing you anymore. Not because threats disappeared, but because the system no longer frames experience as pursuit. Pressure dissolves when it is no longer personalized. Events happen, signals arrive. None of them require you to run. You may notice that when something unexpected appears, the body responds with curiosity rather than contraction. This response is subtle but significant. Curiosity keeps channels open. Contraction closes them. The system now favors openness because it trusts its ability to adapt in real time. This trust alters how you experience complexity. Complexity no longer overwhelms. It organizes itself as attention meets it without bias. You do not need to simplify prematurely. You allow patterns to reveal themselves at their own pace. When recognition occurs, it feels obvious rather than earned. There is a quiet refinement in how you sense boundaries. Boundaries are no longer rigid lines you defend. They are gradients you feel. You know when to engage more closely and when to step back without having to justify either choice. The system reads resonance directly. You might find that some relationships shift without explanation, not through conflict or decision, but through natural rebalancing. Where coherence is present, connection deepens effortlessly. Where it is not, distance forms without drama. This is not loss. It is reconfiguration. This reconfiguration can feel strangely neutral. There is no surge of emotion attached to it. The system does not interpret change as failure or success. It interprets it as adjustment. Adjustments are constant when awareness is accurate. You may notice that your internal dialogue has become less persuasive. Thoughts still arise, but they do not command belief automatically. You hear them without needing to agree. This reduces internal tension more than any attempt to replace thoughts ever did. As belief loosens, perception sharpens. You see situations more clearly when you are not invested in a particular interpretation. The observer remains available without collapsing into conclusion. This availability allows response to remain flexible. There is also a shift in how you experience effort over time. Fatigue becomes more informative. Instead of pushing through it, you recognize it as a signal to adjust. Rest is no longer reactive. It is responsive. The system recovers faster when it listens earlier. You might sense that your capacity has not decreased, even though your pace has softened. In fact, capacity often increases when waste is removed. Energy that was spent on internal negotiation becomes available for direct engagement. This efficiency does not feel mechanical, it feels humane. You move with more care, not because you are cautious, but because you are present. Presence refines action without slowing it unnecessarily. There can be moments when you realize how little you need to explain yourself now. Silence communicates enough. Your state is legible without translation. When explanation is required, it comes without defensiveness. The system does not prepare arguments in advance. This lack of preparation frees attention. You are not rehearsing conversations that may never occur. You are not pre-solving problems that may resolve on their own. The system remains responsive rather than anticipatory. You may notice that the sense of being evaluated has diminished. Not because evaluation ceased, but because it no longer defines orientation. Feedback arrives, registers, and integrates without altering your baseline. The observer does not confuse data with identity. This distinction brings a quiet steadiness to how you show up. You do not need to perform consistency. It emerges naturally when internal signals are aligned. Others may notice this steadiness without being able to name it. There is a simplicity in how you now relate to goals. Goals exist, but they do not dominate. They are reference points, not demands. Movement toward them occurs when conditions support it. When they do not, waiting feels appropriate rather than indulgent. This appropriateness replaces force. Force was often used to compensate for misalignment. As alignment increases, force becomes unnecessary. The system prefers minimal intervention when maximal clarity is present. You might sense that your awareness has widened without becoming diffuse. You hold more without gripping. You notice more without tracking. This balance allows you to remain engaged without becoming overwhelmed. There is no need to stabilize this further. It is already self-stabilizing. Any attempt to hold it would introduce tension. Let it remain unheld. Let it function as a quiet background condition that supports whatever arises next. The signal you are within does not crescendo. It levels. It becomes a steady tone rather than a peak. This tone does not demand attention. It remains present whether you notice it or not. Coherence does not require acknowledgement to persist. You may begin to notice that even the idea of progress has softened, not abandoned, but reframed. Movement no longer needs to feel linear to feel valid. Some days appear quiet, almost uneventful, and yet something essential continues to integrate beneath the surface. The system does not require visible markers to confirm that it is functioning. There is a growing ease in allowing things to remain incomplete, not out of avoidance, but out of trust. You recognize when something needs time rather than effort. This recognition prevents premature closure. It allows processes to unfold without being forced into resolution. You might sense that your relationship with attention has become less possessive. You are not trying to hold focus tightly. When attention wanders, it returns without reprimand. This gentleness keeps the system relaxed. Tension was often introduced by trying to control what did not require control. As this continues, the boundary between inner and outer experience feels less rigid. Sensations, thoughts, and external events are all registered within the same field. None are elevated above the others. This equal weighting reduces internal hierarchy and the conflict it generates. You may notice that your capacity to be with discomfort has increased, even though discomfort itself has decreased. When it does arise, it is met without urgency. The system recognizes it as information rather than threat. This recognition prevents escalation. There is also a subtle change in how you relate to desire. Wanting no longer carries the same tension. Desire can exist without immediately demanding satisfaction. This does not dull motivation, it refines it. Actions taken from this place feel cleaner, less entangled with outcome. You might observe that your sense of orientation is no longer tied to constant feedback. You do not need frequent confirmation that you are on the right path. The idea of a single path loses relevance when alignment is felt internally rather than measured externally. This internal orientation creates a quiet resilience. When circumstances shift unexpectedly, the system adapts without collapse. You do not need to rebuild your footing each time something changes. Stability is no longer dependent on predictability. There can be moments when you realize how little you are narrating your experience now. Life is happening without commentary layered on top. This reduces cognitive load. You are present for what is occurring, rather than for your interpretation of it. You may notice that when you do speak, words come more slowly. Not because you are hesitant, but because they are less rehearsed. Speech aligns more closely with what is actually being sensed. This alignment makes communication feel more precise, even when it is minimal. The sense of being watched or measured, internally or externally, continues to fade. You are less aware of yourself as an object. You experience yourself more as a process. Processes do not need approval to continue. They adjust based on conditions. This adjustment happens quietly. You do not feel yourself changing. You simply notice that certain reactions no longer occur. Certain patterns no longer complete their loop. The absence of these loops is not dramatic. It is noticed only in hindsight. You may find that your relationship with uncertainty has become almost neutral. It no longer triggers anticipation or dread. It is simply an open variable. The system holds it without needing to resolve it immediately. There is a calm efficiency in this holding. Energy is not wasted on speculation. Attention remains available for what is actually present. This availability improves responsiveness without increasing effort. You might sense that stillness is no longer something you return to. It is something you depart from briefly when action is required, and then naturally re-enter. This reverses the old pattern where stillness felt rare and effort felt constant. The observer now rests more often than it moves. When it does move, it does so lightly. Observation does not harden into judgment. Detection does not escalate into control. The system remains flexible. There is nothing to secure at this stage. Security was often sought as a way to manage uncertainty. As uncertainty becomes tolerable, the need for security diminishes. What remains is adaptability. This adaptability is quiet. It does not announce readiness. It simply responds when needed. You may not notice it until a situation arises that once would have destabilized you and now does not. The signal you are within has become so integrated that it no longer feels like a signal. It feels like baseline. The system has registered stillness, not as an event, but as a reference state. From this reference, everything else can be met without distortion, without urgency, without the need to return anywhere else. There is no sense now of arriving anywhere. What remains does not register as completion. It feels more like quiet continuity. Experience continues to unfold, but it does so without demanding commentary or interpretation. You are not holding this state. You are simply not interrupting it. Stillness no longer feels like a contrast to movement. It feels like the ground movement arises from and returns to. When activity appears, it does not displace calm. When calm deepens, it does not negate activity. Both coexist without competing for dominance. You may notice that attention rests more easily in the body. Sensations are felt without being scanned for meaning. Breath moves without being guided. The system inhabits itself fully, without checking whether it should be elsewhere. This inhabiting does not feel heavy. It feels settled. Thoughts continue to come and go, but they do not organize the field. They are events within it, not the structure of it. You do not need to quiet them. They quiet themselves when not engaged. Silence emerges naturally when it is not pursued. There is a sense that nothing is required to maintain this configuration. No practice, no reminder, no effort to preserve it. What remains is resilient because it is simple. Complexity dissolves when unnecessary layers are removed. You may sense that your relationship with effort has permanently recalibrated. Effort now appears only when it is useful, then withdraws. There is no need to keep it running in the background. The system conserves itself without instruction. Time continues, but it no longer presses. Moments pass without being evaluated for productivity or significance. Some moments feel empty, others full, and neither demands explanation. They are all permitted to exist as they are. You might notice that the urge to seek has quieted, not because everything has been found, but because seeking is no longer mistaken for orientation. Orientation now arises internally, without movement toward or away from anything. This internal orientation does not point in a direction. It stabilizes perception. From that stability, responses emerge when conditions call for them. When conditions do not, rest remains unchallenged. There is a quiet acceptance here that nothing needs to be resolved. Unanswered questions can remain open. Incomplete stories can remain unfinished. The system no longer experiences openness as lack. It experiences it as space. You are not being guided forward. You are not being held back. You are simply present within a field that no longer fragments your attention. This presence does not feel special. It feels ordinary, and that ordinariness is its strength. The signal that registered when stillness was chosen does not repeat itself. It does not need to. Registration is not an ongoing event. It is a condition that remains once established. The system remembers without reminders. You can move from here without leaving this. You can rest from here without stopping anything. Stillness is no longer something you enter. It is something that underlies whatever happens next. There is nothing further to do with this recognition, nothing to apply, nothing to share. It exists quietly, without asking to be used. The system continues, coherent, responsive, and unforced. What remains now is simply this: awareness resting in itself, without urgency, without resistance, without need for conclusion. The moment does not close. It continues, exactly as it is, sufficient and complete, without needing to be named.